The torch was already lit when Thomas Dunlap rode up to the last homestead standing in the Cimarron Valley, and the woman inside did not even put down her baby. It was the autumn of 1882, and the valley had been emptying out for the better part of 3 months. The Hargrove Land Company had seen to that, one by one, methodically and without mercy, burning out the small homesteaders who had staked their claims along the creek bottoms and the gentle slopes of the Cimarron grasslands in the Oklahoma Territory. Old Jeremiah Potts had been the first to go, his modest sod house reduced to smoldering ruins on a Tuesday morning in late July while he stood helpless in his field. The Garfield family had packed their wagon and left without waiting to be pushed out, taking their 4 children and their milk cow east toward Kansas. The McCready brothers had fought back briefly, and that had ended badly enough that nobody else tried anything of the sort. And so the valley had emptied, homestead by homestead, family by family, until only one remained. Susanna Fairchild's place sat at the far southern end of the valley where the creek made a wide bend, and the cottonwood trees grew tall and gold in the October light. It was a proper house, not just a dugout or a sod shanty, but a real frame house her husband Caleb had built with timber hauled in from 50 miles away. There was a porch across the front of it, and 2 glass windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back across the yard in long, bright lines. There was a kitchen garden running along the south side of the house, stripped now of its summer bounty but still neat and fenced against the deer. There was a good barn with a solid roof, and 3 horses in the paddock, and a flock of chickens that moved about the yard in that aimless, determined way that chickens do. It was, by any measure, the most established piece of property in the whole Cimarron Valley, which was precisely why Hargrove had saved it for last. Caleb Fairchild had been dead for 7 months. He had ridden into Millhaven to file papers at the land office, and he had been found 3 days later at the bottom of a draw 4 miles outside of town with a bullet in his back. The sheriff of Millhaven, a man named Craddock who drew his salary from the Hargrove Land Company as surely as he drew breath, had ruled it an accident, a riding accident, on a horse Caleb had owned for 6 years and trusted with his life. Susanna had known better, and everyone in the valley had known better, but knowing and proving were different things entirely in the Oklahoma Territory in 1882, and the Hargrove Land Company understood that distinction very well indeed. So Susanna had stayed. 7 months along in her pregnancy when Caleb was buried, she had stayed through the winter and through the spring and through the long hot summer, and in April she had given birth alone with no one but old Mrs. Teague from 2 miles up the valley to help her, and the baby was a boy she named James Caleb Fairchild, and he was 6 months old now and healthy as a colt and loud as a church bell when he wanted feeding. And still she stayed. Thomas Dunlap had ridden into the Cimarron Valley from the west, which was not the direction most men came from. Most men came up from Millhaven or down from the Kansas line, but Thomas had come across the high plains from New Mexico Territory, moving east without any particular plan except to put distance between himself and the man he used to be. He was 28 years old, and he had spent the last 4 of those years working for men he was not proud to have worked for, doing things he was not proud to have done, and somewhere along the way the accounting inside himself had grown too heavy to carry comfortably. He was not a bad man who had gone good overnight. He was a complicated man who had been slowly, painfully waking up. He had taken the job with the Hargrove Land Company 3 weeks ago in Millhaven, presenting himself to the company agent, a slick-haired man named Prescott, as exactly the kind of rider they were looking for. A man with no local connections, a man with a fast horse and a cold manner and no apparent conscience. Prescott had not asked too many questions. The job was simple, Prescott said. There was one last homestead in the Cimarron Valley that needed clearing. The woman who lived there had been given every opportunity to sell and had refused every one of them. The company needed that land, and the company needed it by the 1st of November. Thomas was to go out there and make her understand the situation. Prescott had handed him the torch as a suggestion, not an order, but a suggestion from a man like Prescott had a way of sounding very much like an order. Thomas had ridden out to the valley in the cool of the October morning, and as he covered the miles between Millhaven and the Fairchild homestead, something had been eating at him, gnawing steadily through whatever remained of the armor he had built around himself over 4 hard years. He told himself it was just nerves. He told himself he had done worse things than run off a widow with a baby, which was technically true and also entirely beside the point. He told himself the company paid well, and he needed the money, which was almost certainly not true because Thomas Dunlap had no idea what he would spend money on anyway. The homestead came into view around a long bend in the creek road, and even from half a mile away, it was clearly something different from the other places he had burned out over the years, working for one outfit or another. It had a quality of permanence about it, of intention, of someone having looked at a piece of ground and said, "This is where I belong." The cottonwood trees around it were enormous and golden, and the morning light lay across the whole scene with the kind of beauty that made a man feel small and shabby inside. He dismounted at the gate. He stood there for a moment with the unlit torch in his hand. He could smell the creek water and the dry grass and the faint sweetness of horses. He struck the match, and then the front door of the house opened. Susanna Fairchild walked out onto her porch with her son James on her left hip, the baby drowsy from feeding, his small dark head tucked against her shoulder. She was 24 years old, with dark hair that was pinned up but falling loose in the way hair does when a person has been busy since before sunrise, and her eyes were the color of creek water in deep shade, green and brown and something else entirely. She was wearing a plain blue dress with an apron over it, and her feet were in boots that needed new soles but were laced up properly. She stood on that porch and looked at the man at her gate and at the burning torch in his hand, and she did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not pull the baby closer against her in that protective way women sometimes did when they were afraid. She just looked at him with those deep-water eyes and waited. Thomas held the burning torch and felt, with absolute certainty and for the first time in 4 years, thoroughly ashamed of himself. "You must be one of Hargrove's men," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest voice Thomas Dunlap had heard in a long time, maybe ever. "Yes, ma'am," he said, because it was the truth. "And that torch is for my house." That was the intention. "Was," she repeated, catching the word. Thomas looked at the torch. He looked at it for a long moment. This burning thing in his hand that represented everything he had been willing to do for money, and the habit of not feeling anything. Then he stepped to the side and pushed the burning end of it down into the soft dirt beside the gatepost until the flame went out. He straightened up and looked at her again. "I don't think I'm going to be burning down your house today," he said. Susanna Fairchild looked at him for a long, careful moment. The baby on her hip made a small sound and shifted, grabbing a fistful of her hair, and she reached up automatically and loosened his grip without ever taking her eyes off the man at her gate. "No," she said finally, "I didn't think you would." "How could you know that?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "I didn't know it," she said. "I just decided that I was not going to act as though I didn't." He did not know what to do with that. He stood at her gate with the dead torch in his hand and the autumn light on his face and the feeling of having arrived somewhere entirely unexpected. "You should probably come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." He hadn't, actually. He had not been able to eat that morning, and when he tried to recall what he had eaten the evening before, he could only come up with half a tin of beans at a cold camp. He tied his horse at the fence and walked up the path to her porch, and she held the door open for him, and he went inside. The house was warm and clean and smelled of wood smoke and something baking. It was a real home, properly furnished, with a table and 4 chairs and a rag rug on the floor and curtains at the windows. There were books on a shelf along one wall, a dozen or so, and a photograph on the mantelpiece of a man and a woman on their wedding day. Thomas looked at the photograph and then looked away. He sat at the table where she indicated and watched her settle the baby into a wooden cradle near the stove, rocking it twice with her foot until James settled back toward sleep. She put a plate of cornbread and cold pork in front of him and poured coffee from a pot on the stove, and then she sat down across the table from him with her own cup and watched him eat. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas Dunlap." "Where are you from, Thomas Dunlap?" "Lots of places," he said. "Originally from Tennessee, haven't been back in 10 years. How long have you been working for Hargrove?" He swallowed the cornbread. 3 weeks. Before that, other men like him, Thomas said. Different names, same work. She received that without any visible judgment. "And you've done this before, burned out homesteaders." It was not a question. He answered it anyway. "Yes." "But not today." "Not today," he agreed. "Why not today?" Thomas set down his fork. He looked at the woman across the table from him, at the steadiness in her face and the tiredness under her eyes and the way she held herself like a person who had already considered every possible bad outcome and decided to sit still through all of them. "Because you walked out onto that porch with your baby," he said slowly, "and you looked at me like I was a man and not just a thing that was happening to you. And I couldn't do it." Susanna was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse in the paddock nickered softly at something. The baby made a small sleep sound. "The other homesteaders," she said. "They're all gone now." "Yes, ma'am." "Did any of them have a choice?" "Not much of one." She nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they hear what they already suspected confirmed. "My husband was not a riding accident," she said. "No," Thomas said. "I don't expect he was. Prescott ordered it. I don't know who ordered it specifically, but that's the kind of work the company does when people won't move. I've seen it before." Susanna looked down at her coffee cup. For just a moment, just the briefest fraction of a moment, something moved across her face that was not steadiness but grief, real and deep and ongoing, and then it was gone again behind that composure she wore like a second skin. "He was a good man," she said quietly. "He built this house with his own hands. He planted those cottonwood trees along the fence line. They were just saplings when we came here." Thomas looked out the window at the big gold trees. He tried to imagine the man in the wedding photograph planting them as slim young sticks in the ground, tried to imagine that act of faith in the future that planting a tree represents. It sat badly with him, that image. "I'm sorry," he said. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate, but he meant it, which was more than he could say for most of what he had said in the last 4 years. Susanna looked at him and accepted the apology for what it was. "What happens now?" she asked. "When you go back to Prescott without the job done, he'll send someone else. Someone who won't stop, probably. How much time do I have? A few days, maybe. Long enough for him to wonder why I haven't reported back, and then long enough for whoever he sends to make the ride out here." Susanna was quiet, thinking. The stove ticked. The cradle stood still. Thomas watched her think and found himself doing something he had not done in a very long time, which was genuinely wanting to know what someone else was deciding. "There's a lawyer in Caldwell," she said at last. "Kansas. A man named Aldous Briggs. He's handled land claims before, fought the bigger companies. Caleb wrote to him twice, but the letters took so long, and then Caleb died before anything could happen. If I could get word to him, get him to file an injunction against the company's claim on this land. That takes time," Thomas said. "I know it takes time. Do you have a better idea?" He didn't immediately. But as he sat in the warm kitchen with the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of a sleeping baby, and the memory of how it had felt to look at this woman and feel his own shame looking back at him, an idea began to take shape. It was not a comfortable idea. It was the kind of idea that would put him squarely against the people who were expecting a service from him, and in his line of work that was a dangerous position. But the alternative was to ride away and let Prescott send a man who would not stop, and Thomas Dunlap discovered, sitting at Susanna Fairchild's kitchen table on that October morning, that he was no longer willing to be that kind of man. "I can ride to Caldwell," he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm already on the wrong side of Prescott whether I do this or not, If I go back without the job done, I'm finished with the company. If I go back and tell him I can't do it, same thing. Either way, I'm done." He paused. Might as well be done for something worth doing. The look she was giving him shifted slightly, deepened somehow. "You could just leave," she said. "Ride west. Forget any of this happened." "I could," he agreed. "But I've been riding west for 4 years trying to forget things, and it doesn't work as well as you'd hope." A small, cautious thing happened at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was related to one. It changed her face considerably. "Caldwell is a hard 2 days' ride from here," she said. "I know. And in the meantime, do you have a rifle, too?" she said. "And I know how to use both of them." He didn't doubt it. "Then you stay put and you keep your eyes open, and I'll be back inside of 4 days with Aldous Briggs or a letter from him at minimum." She looked at him for a long time. He had the sensation of being assessed very thoroughly, in the way that a person who has had to develop excellent judgment about people very quickly sometimes assesses a stranger. He sat still under it and let her look. "All right, Thomas Dunlap," she said at last. "But if you're going to do this, there's something you should know first. The land claim Hargrove is using to push people off this valley is fraudulent. Caleb found out before he died. There's a surveyor's report, a real one, filed with the Federal Land Office in Guthrie in 1879, that shows this valley was open to homestead claims under the terms of the 1862 Homestead Act. The Hargrove Land Company is claiming they bought it from the Cherokee Nation, but the Cherokee had already ceded this particular strip under the Treaty of 1866, and the federal claim predates any subsequent sale they could have made. Caleb had copies of all of it. It's in a tin box under the floorboards in the bedroom." Thomas stared at her. "You've had this all along." "We've had it all along, but a document under a floorboard doesn't stop a man with a torch. It needs someone who knows the law and has standing in a court to make it mean something. Briggs can do that if that documentation is solid. It is solid. I've read every page of it. Then this isn't just about your homestead. Every family that's been burned out of this valley, every claim that's been destroyed, they all have recourse if the fraud can be proven," Susanna said quietly. "Hargrove's entire land grab would unravel." Thomas sat back in his chair. The size of what she was telling him settled over him slowly. This was not just a widow holding on to her husband's work. This was a woman who had been carefully, methodically building a case, waiting for the right moment and the right person to carry it forward. She had been waiting him out, he realized, not just today, but perhaps for months. "You could have sent this to Briggs yourself," he said, "by post." "Letters get lost," she said, "or intercepted. The postmaster in Millhaven works for Hargrove. I needed someone who could carry it in person and who had enough reason not to give it to the wrong people." She looked at him steadily. "Someone who'd already had a change of heart." "You planned this," he said slowly. "I hoped for it," she corrected. "There's a difference." She paused. "Most men Hargrove sends out here don't stop when they see me on the porch. You're the third one this year. The first one burned the Potts homestead with me watching and didn't blink. The second one I ran off with a rifle and he went back and Hargrove sent 6 men the following week, and that's how the McCready brothers ended up the way they did. And me. You stopped," she said simply. "You put the torch out." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking about the other 2 men, thinking about what it said about him that he was the third and not the first. "What made you think I would?" "I didn't think it. I told you. I decided not to act as though you wouldn't." She picked up her coffee cup. "Sometimes how you treat a person determines who they become in that moment. I've believed that for a long time." He looked at her across the table and felt something happen inside his chest that was inconvenient and complicated and entirely real. He pushed it aside because this was not the time for it. There was work to be done and a hard ride to Caldwell ahead of him, and a land company that was going to be very displeased when it figured out what he was doing. He stood up and picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table. "Get me those documents," he said. "All of them. I'll wrap them in oilskin so they ride safe." She rose without a word and went through the door to the bedroom. He heard the sound of a floorboard being lifted and then replaced, and when she came back she was carrying a flat tin box, not large, about the size of a writing tablet. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside, wrapped carefully in folded paper, was a substantial collection of documents, all of them handled with great care, some of them official-looking with stamps and seals. "The Federal Survey report is on top," she said. "Then the original homestead filings for all the valley claims with the dates. Then Caleb's copies of the treaty sections and the Federal Land Office correspondence, and at the bottom, his notes on the discrepancies in Hargrove's purchase claim." Thomas went through them quickly but carefully, and even with his limited legal knowledge he could see that Caleb Fairchild had done thorough work. The man had been building this case piece by piece, paper by paper, for years. "Your husband was a careful man," Thomas said. "He was," Susanna said. "He knew what was coming, he just didn't." She stopped. "Didn't expect it to come for him specifically," Thomas finished. "No." She closed the tin box and handed it to him. "Bring this back, Thomas, whatever else happens." "I will," he said. She found him a piece of oilskin from a drawer and he wrapped the box in it and tucked it into his saddlebag with a security he hoped wasn't false. He checked his horse's cinch and his canteen, and when he turned around she was standing on the porch with the baby on her hip again, and the morning light was on her face, and the cottonwood trees were gold and moving in the October breeze. "4 days," he said. "4 days," she agreed. "Be careful." He rode north and east toward Caldwell, and he did not look back more than twice. The ride to Caldwell took him through some of the most beautiful country Thomas Dunlap had ever passed through without actually seeing, because he was thinking too hard about Susanna Fairchild and the tin box under his saddlebag, and the 3 weeks of bad choices that had led him to her gate with a lit torch. He made good time the first day, covering the better part of 40 miles before the light failed, and he camped cold near a limestone bluff with a small fire just large enough to boil water for coffee. He lay on his bedroll and watched the stars and thought about a woman standing on a porch with her baby and not flinching, and found that he could think of very little else. The second day brought wind from the north, which slowed him but not enough to matter, and by late afternoon he was riding into Caldwell, Kansas, which in 1882 was still a significant cattle town, busy and loud and smelling strongly of livestock and commerce. He asked directions to the law office of Aldous Briggs at the first place he stopped, which happened to be a livery stable. Aldous Briggs was not what Thomas had expected. He was a small, precise man of perhaps 55, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and a quality of deep, contained energy that reminded Thomas of a clock with very good works inside. His office was a room above a hardware store, with shelves of legal volumes and stacks of documents tied with ribbon, and when Thomas came in and set the tin box on his desk and explained the situation, Briggs listened without interrupting, which was the mark of either a very experienced lawyer or a very intelligent man, and in Briggs's case it appeared to be both. When Thomas finished, Briggs opened the tin box and began reading. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. Thomas sat in the chair across the desk and waited, which was not something he was generally good at, but which he managed tolerably under the circumstances. "This is a remarkable collection of documentation," Briggs said at last. "Enough to stop Hargrove, enough to start stopping him, which is the part that takes preparation." Briggs set down the document he was reading and took off his spectacles to clean them. "The fraudulent land claim is clear if you have the right judge. The problem is that the right judges are in the federal district, not in Millhaven, and getting an injunction filed and served takes time." "How much time?" "Properly done, 30 days. "She may not have 30 days. Briggs replaced his spectacles. "No, she may not. But I can write a letter today that is addressed to the Federal Land Commissioner in Guthrie, with a certified copy of the survey documentation, and if that letter is received and the Commissioner acts on it, Hargrove's company is operating on land under federal dispute. That creates legal exposure for anyone who takes further action against Mrs. Fairchild's property. It doesn't guarantee safety, but it raises the stakes considerably for the people giving orders. And you'll go to the valley." Briggs looked at him with a steady, scholarly gaze. "I will go to the valley. But I need 3 days to prepare properly, which means copying these documents, filing the initial correspondence, and arranging my travel. I'll take the documents myself since you're right that they cannot be trusted to the post." He paused. "In the meantime, Mr. Dunlap, you should go back to Mrs. Fairchild." "I intended to. She's been alone on that property for 7 months. She has held her position with extraordinary determination, but determination alone will not stop a fire." Briggs looked at him with a precision that felt almost pointed. "Go back. I will follow in 3 days." Thomas was back on his horse and riding south before the sun was fully down, planning to ride through the early dark until the moon failed him, and then camp briefly and push on at first light. It was a harder return than the outward journey had been, partly because of the urgency, and partly because of what he would not allow himself to examine too closely, which was the fact that he was riding back to a place at a speed that had very little to do with legal strategy. He made it in a day and a half. He came over the last rise and saw the Fairchild homestead below him in the shallow valley, and felt his shoulders drop with a relief he had not known he was carrying all the way from Caldwell. The smoke from the kitchen chimney was visible, which meant the house was standing, and there was a fire in the stove, which meant everything was all right. He rode down through the cottonwoods and across the creek ford and up to the fence, and Susanna came out onto the porch before he had even dismounted, and this time she was carrying the baby in one arm and a rifle in the other until she saw who it was, and then she lowered the rifle, and the expression on her face was something he wanted to carry around in his pocket for the rest of his life. "You came back," she said. "I said I would. Men say a lot of things." He stepped down from his horse and tied it at the fence. His whole body ached from the riding. "Briggs will be here in 3 days. He's got the documents. He's filing federal correspondence today, and he says the fraud case is solid." She closed her eyes for just a moment, and he could see from the movement in her throat how much that meant to her. When she opened them again, they were brighter than before. "Come inside," she said. "You look terrible." "Thank you," he said, and followed her up the path. She fed him again, this time a proper supper of salt pork and beans and cornbread, and there was a quality to the table between them now that had not been there 3 days ago, something more settled, less provisional. The baby sat in his cradle near the stove and watched the ceiling with the intense concentration that babies bring to looking at ceilings, and the lamplight was warm and the wind had come up outside and was moving through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. "What will you do?" Susanna asked. "After Briggs comes, after this is settled?" Thomas considered the question seriously, because it deserved serious consideration. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been doing the same kind of work for 4 years and I'm done with it. I don't have a particular place, don't have people waiting on me anywhere." "That sounds lonely," she said. It was not a pitying observation. It was just a statement offered in the same direct way she offered everything. "It is," he admitted. "I didn't let myself think about it much." "What did you want to do before all of it?" He thought about Tennessee, which he rarely allowed himself to do. "My family had a farm," he said. "Not much, a few hundred acres, mostly tobacco and some corn. I was good at it, knew how things grew, knew when to plant and when to leave things alone." He paused. "My father lost it after the war. Couldn't pay the taxes. We scattered the family. I went west because there was nothing east to go back to." Susanna listened to this with her chin resting on her hand, and her attention had a quality to it that was rare in Thomas's experience, which was the quality of genuinely wanting to understand rather than waiting for her turn to speak. "Caleb was from Ohio," she said. "He came out here because he believed in it, in the idea of it, the opportunity. He used to say that a man who was willing to work the land should be able to own it, that it was a principle the country was founded on even if it didn't always live up to it." She glanced at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "He was an optimist. I thought it was naive when I first met him. I came to love it about him." "When did you meet him?" "In 1877. I was 19 and he was 23, and we were both at a land lottery in Wichita. I was there with my uncle who was looking at cattle land. Caleb was there alone with a bag of tools and $10 and more confidence than most men carry in their whole lives. She smiled at the memory, a real smile this time, full and unguarded, and it was briefly quite devastating to look at. He asked me to dance at a church social that same evening, and I said yes because he was the only man in the room who danced like he meant it. And then I went home with my uncle and spent 6 months writing letters to Ohio, and he came and asked my father for my hand in the spring of 1878, and we were married in June and came out here in August. She looked around the room. He built this table the first winter. Took him 3 weeks because the wood was green and kept warping. He was so furious about it. Thomas looked at the table. It was a good table, solid and true, with careful joinery at the corners. He did good work. He did, she said. Her voice was even, but there was a weight in it that was permanent, the weight of someone who has integrated a loss into the fabric of who they are without letting it destroy them. Thomas found it unbearably moving. The evening passed quietly. He slept in the barn, on a pile of clean hay, which was better than any of his recent campsites, and which smelled agreeably of horses and dry grass. He lay awake for a while listening to the horses shift and breathe, and overhead the October sky was absolutely full of stars, and he thought that of all the places he had found himself in the last 4 years, this was the first one that felt, even slightly, like somewhere a person might want to remain. The next day passed without incident. Thomas spent much of it making a visible inspection of the property's approaches, partly out of genuine security concern, and partly because having something practical to do kept him from hovering around the house in a way that felt inappropriate. He found that the access from the Southern Creek Road was well screened by brush and the cottonwoods, and that any approach from the north was visible from the porch for a good quarter-mile. He reinforced the latch on the barn door, which had been weakening, and replaced a loose board on the porch steps, because there was a toolbox in the barn and he had nothing else useful to do, and Susanna didn't tell him to stop. She came out in the middle of the afternoon with James on her hip and a cup of coffee for him, and they sat on the porch steps together while the baby examined Thomas's coat button with an expression of deep scientific inquiry. It was a perfectly ordinary domestic scene, and Thomas was entirely undone by it. "He likes you," Susanna said. "He likes the button," Thomas said. "He's discerning. Usually he cries at strangers." Thomas looked down at the small, dark-haired head bent over his coat with such concentration. James Caleb Fairchild was 6 months old and already had his mother's quality of complete attention to whatever was in front of him. It was a good quality. Thomas hoped the boy kept it. "He looks like his father," Susanna said. "In the photograph, Caleb had the same way of frowning when he was thinking about something." Thomas looked at the baby. He did seem to be frowning slightly over the button in a thoughtful rather than displeased way. "I see it," he said. They were quiet for a few minutes. The afternoon was cooling, the light going amber and long across the grass. "What will happen to the families who were burned out?" Thomas asked. "If Briggs wins the case?" "They can file claims for damages," Susanna said. "Whether they'll actually receive anything is another matter. The law moves slowly, especially when the company has money to slow it. But the land itself, the valley, that would be protected. The people who want to come back could come back." She paused. "Old Jeremiah Potts. He has a sister in Millhaven, been staying with her since the summer. He's not too old to rebuild if someone helped him." Thomas thought about that. He thought about the valley as it had been before the systematic burning, with a dozen homesteads spread along the creek and families working their claims in the big, open, difficult, magnificent country. It was the kind of place a man could work himself back to something real if he had a reason to stay. He looked at Susanna and found her looking at him, and they both looked away at approximately the same moment, which was either a coincidence or a kind of conversation. The second day passed. Then the third day came, and in the early afternoon Aldous Briggs arrived from Caldwell in a rented buckboard, wearing a town suit that was completely inappropriate for the terrain, and carrying 2 leather cases that clinked with the weight of legal documents. He was accompanied by a young man he introduced as his clerk, Nathaniel Good, who was perhaps 20 years old and enormously earnest. Susanna received Briggs on the porch with a quality of controlled relief that Thomas had come to recognize as her version of great emotion, and the lawyer came inside and spread his documents across the kitchen table and spent the next 2 hours explaining the legal strategy in precise, rapid language that Thomas followed imperfectly, but Susanna followed completely, asking questions that impressed even Briggs. "The federal injunction was filed this morning by telegraph," Briggs told her, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "I sent a certified copy of the survey report to the Land Commissioner's office in Guthrie and a second copy to the district court in Wichita. As of today, any further action against property in the Cimarron Valley by the Hargrove Land Company constitutes interference with a federal land dispute, which is a federal offense." "Will Hargrove know that?" Thomas asked. "He will when the notice of dispute is served on his company agent, which will happen in Millhaven within the week. Prescott will receive it personally. And before that week is up, I have a second document." Briggs produced a paper with a large official-looking seal. "This is a court order from a justice of the peace in Caldwell, who has provisional jurisdiction in emergency land matters, enjoining the Hargrove Land Company from any action affecting the Fairchild property pending resolution of the federal dispute. It is somewhat irregular, but it is legal, and it creates sufficient legal exposure that any man Hargrove sends out here will think very carefully before doing anything that could land him in federal court." Susanna picked up the order and read it carefully. Thomas watched her face as she read, watched the careful, precise attention she brought to every word, and thought about what she had said 3 days ago about how you treat a person determining who they become in that moment. He was beginning to think that applied to more than just moments. He was beginning to think it was the whole principle of how a life was shaped. "It says provisional," she said. "The full case will take time," Briggs acknowledged. "But the fraud evidence your husband assembled is thorough. I expect the full injunction to be confirmed within 60 days and the recovery action on behalf of the displaced families within 6 months." He paused. "Mrs. Fairchild, your husband's work on these documents was exceptional. It was the work of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and was very determined to see it through." Susanna's jaw tightened slightly. "He knew the risks," she said. "He kept going anyway." "As have you," Briggs said quietly. "As have you." That evening, for the first time since Thomas had arrived back at the homestead, the tension that had been running underneath everything like a current in a river went slack. Briggs and his clerk set up their camp in the barn, and Susanna cooked supper for all 4 of them. And there was a quality to the meal that was almost celebratory, or at least contained the beginning of a reasonable hope that had not been present before. After supper, Briggs and Nathaniel retired early, and Thomas helped Susanna clear the table, and when the dishes were done and the baby had been settled for the night and the lamp was burning low, they sat by the stove with fresh coffee and talked the way people talk when the immediate emergency has passed, and there is nothing required of the conversation except honesty. "What will you do when this is over?" She asked him again the same question she had asked his first evening back, but with a different quality to it now. "I've been thinking about that," he said, and he looked at his coffee cup for a moment, then up at her. "I was thinking about whether there's work to be found in the valley, building work mostly. If the families come back, they'll need help rebuilding what was burned. I know something about construction. I know how to read land and work it." He paused. "I thought I might stay." Susanna looked at him steadily. "Stay where?" "In the valley," he said. And then, because she was the kind of person who deserved the straight truth and he was becoming the kind of man who could give it, near here if that was acceptable. She was quiet for a moment that lasted several lifetimes. The stove ticked. The baby breathed in his cradle. The October wind moved through the cottonwoods. "I am not going to pretend that I don't understand what you're suggesting," she said carefully. "I'm also not going to pretend that the last 5 days haven't changed something." But I need to say something honestly. Please do. I loved my husband, she said. I still love him. He's in that baby's face every time I look at it, and he's in these walls and in the table he built and the trees he planted, and that is not a small thing, and it does not disappear. I know that, Thomas said. I'm not asking it to. What are you asking? He thought about it carefully. Permission to be in the vicinity, he said. To be useful and present and honest. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel or to do anything before you're ready. I'm asking to not ride west again with nothing behind me. Something softened in her face. It was not surrender, it was not capitulation. It was the careful, considered opening of a door that had been locked for a long time and was now being tested on its hinges to see if it still worked. You can stay, she said quietly. For now, we'll see what comes. He nodded. He would take that. He would take that and be grateful for it. The following morning Prescott arrived. He came with 4 men, which was 4 more than Thomas had expected, and they came from the north along the main creek road in the early morning, before the sun was fully up, riding in the way men ride when they mean business. Briggs heard them first, or rather his clerk Nathaniel heard them, being a light sleeper, and roused the lawyer, who came out of the barn in his shirt sleeves to find Thomas already on the porch with his rifle and Susanna behind him with hers. Prescott pulled his horse up at the fence and looked at the assembled party with the particular expression of a man who has arrived at a situation considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. Dunlap, he said flatly. Prescott, Thomas replied. You have an explanation for yourself. Several, Thomas said. But the relevant one is that the Fairchild property is currently under a court order protecting it from interference, issued by a justice of the peace in Caldwell, and backed by a federal land dispute filing with the district court in Wichita. Mr. Aldous Briggs, who is standing over there, can explain the details. Prescott's gaze moved to Briggs, who had put on his spectacles and was holding a document in his ink-stained hand with the air of a man who is completely unintimidated and possibly also slightly entertained. Mr. Prescott, Briggs said pleasantly, I believe you'll want to have your company's legal counsel review this order before you take any further action here. The document outlines the federal dispute clearly, and any interference with this property from this point forward would constitute a violation of that order. I would be delighted to send a copy to your offices in Millhaven. He paused. I have several. Prescott stared at Briggs for a long moment. His horse shifted under him. One of the 4 men with him exchanged a glance with another. This isn't over, Prescott said to Thomas. It's not over, Thomas agreed. It's just starting. And it's moving to a courtroom, which is a room I expect you'll find considerably less comfortable than a dark county road. Prescott looked at him with a cold, flat anger that Thomas knew very well and was not particularly afraid of. Then he looked at Susanna, who was standing on the porch of her husband's house with her rifle in her hands and the October dawn behind her, and who looked at him with an expression of such absolute, uncompromising calm that even Prescott seemed to find it briefly disconcerting. Prescott wheeled his horse and rode back north with his 4 men, and they watched the dust settle on the road until there was nothing left to see. Thomas let out a breath slowly. Beside him, Susanna lowered her rifle. That won't be the last of him, she said. No, Thomas agreed. But Briggs is right that it moves to a courtroom now. Prescott's brave enough for torches in the night. He's less brave when there's a federal judge involved. Briggs came up onto the porch, tucking his document back into his case with a satisfied air. I've dealt with men like Prescott before, he said. They're aggressive when the cost is low, raise the cost sufficiently, and they become very reasonable. When will the full court order come through? Susanna asked. 30 days for the preliminary. 60 for the full confirmation. I'll handle all of it from Caldwell, and you'll receive copies of every filing. He looked at her with something that was professional respect but also something warmer. Mrs. Fairchild, I want you to know that your husband's documentation was the backbone of this entire case. What he built, you kept. Between the 2 of you, you've given every family in this valley a path back. Susanna nodded, and this time she did not quite suppress the brightness in her eyes. "He would have been glad to know it," she said. Briggs and Nathaniel departed that afternoon, and the homestead settled back into the particular quiet of a place where a great tension has recently passed through and left the air changed. Thomas spent the remainder of the day doing various practical things around the property, none of which were urgently necessary, all of which were satisfying in a way that work had not been satisfying to him in years. He noticed that the wagon needed a new wheel bolt. He noticed that a stretch of the paddock fence was leaning. He noticed these things and addressed them with tools from the barn, and when Susanna called him in for supper at dusk, the afternoon had passed in a way that felt earned. The weeks that followed had a quality that Thomas Dunlap would never be able to adequately describe, partly because he was not a man given to lyrical expression, and partly because some things resist description in proportion to how much they mean. He stayed on at the homestead, sleeping in the barn initially, then in the spare room when the nights turned genuinely cold in mid-November, and Susanna said the barn was no place for a man to sleep in that weather and he should come inside, which he did without argument. He worked the property alongside her, and he learned the rhythms of her days, which were full and purposeful and running on a schedule that began before dawn and didn't ease until the baby was in his cradle for the night. He learned that she got up an hour before first light to tend the stove and start breakfast, and that she sang to James in the mornings in a low, unconscious way that she probably didn't know she was doing. He learned that she read in the evenings after supper when the lamplight was good, from those dozen books on the shelf, and that she had strong opinions about what she read and was willing to share them if asked. He learned that she laughed at the unexpected things, not at jokes exactly, but at the absurdity that the world regularly presented. A dignified chicken getting surprised by its own reflection in a bucket of water. The way a particular fence post he repaired twice kept leaning the exact same direction no matter how he said it. Small, ridiculous domestic things that she found genuinely funny, and that were funnier for being found so by someone who was also entirely capable of standing on a porch with a rifle without blinking. He fell in love with her the way weather comes to the plains, gradually and then with complete, overwhelming force, so that by the time you were fully aware of it you were already in the middle of it, and there was no clear moment you could point to as the beginning. He did not say so. He worked and he was present and he helped with James, and he fixed things around the property, and he tried to be the kind of man who deserved the trust she was carefully, incrementally extending. He wrote a letter to old Jeremiah Potts in Millhaven, explaining the legal situation and telling the old man that his claim was being defended in court, and that if he wanted to return to the valley, there would be a place to start rebuilding. Potts wrote back in a shaky but emphatic hand that he would be on the road as soon as the court order was confirmed. The preliminary court order came through in late November, as Briggs had promised. He sent a copy to Susanna by courier and a formal notice to Prescott through the district court in Wichita, and with it came the word that the Hargrove Land Company had retained legal counsel and was contesting the fraud claim, which was exactly what Briggs had expected and was prepared for. The battle, as Briggs put it in his accompanying letter, was now properly engaged and would proceed on the field where the company was least comfortable, which was to say a court of law with federal oversight. Prescott did not come back personally. He sent an agent twice, a quiet man named Slade who rode past the property and looked at it and rode away again without doing anything, which Thomas took to mean that the legal exposure was being taken seriously. He stayed watchful, but the immediate physical danger had eased, and the homestead returned to its natural rhythms, which were the rhythms of a working farm in the late autumn, heavy with preparation for winter, and with the particular satisfaction of labor that had a clear and useful purpose. December arrived with cold that was serious and not figurative, and there was a night in the second week of December when a blue norther came down from the Kansas plains, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. Thomas was in the barn seeing to the horses when it hit, and by the time he got back to the house, he was thoroughly cold and Susanna had the stove running high and James was asleep in his cradle, and there were 2 mugs of coffee on the table and a fire crackling in the sitting room hearth. They sat by the fire that night longer than usual because neither of them had any reason to go to bed, and the fire was warm and the wind outside was enormous and impersonal, and made the warmth inside feel like something deliberately created together. At some point in the evening, Susanna fell asleep in her chair, which was not something she ever did, and Thomas sat across from her in the firelight and looked at her sleeping face and felt the full weight of everything that had happened in the 8 weeks since he had ridden up to her gate with a lit torch. He had come to burn down her house. He had come as the instrument of someone else's greed and his own moral exhaustion, and she had walked out onto the porch and looked at him and refused to be a victim of him, refused to let him be the worst version of himself, and everything after that had been a consequence of that single unflinching moment. It seemed to him, sitting in the firelight while the norther howled outside, that he had been handed a kind of redemption he had not asked for and did not entirely deserve, and that the least he could do was live up to it. She woke after about 20 minutes, with that alert wakefulness that new mothers develop, immediately checking on the cradle before she remembered where she was. "You should have woken me," she said, slightly embarrassed. "You needed the sleep." She looked at him across the fire. The light moved on her face and the wind made the walls of the house creak comfortably, the creak of solid construction speaking to the weather. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy here?" It was such a direct question. Of course it was. He should have expected no less from her. "Yes," he said. "More than I've been anywhere in a very long time." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I am too," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. It doesn't feel like a betrayal of Caleb to say it. He was a generous man. He would have understood." Thomas looked at his hands for a moment. "I'm not asking anything." "I know you're not," she said. "That's partly why I'm telling you." The fire cracked and popped. The norther moved over the house like a great rolling wave. Baby James slept deeply in his cradle with both fists raised beside his head in that particular attitude of infant sleep that looks like someone surrendering to joy. "Susanna," Thomas said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I will not pretend I know what I'm doing or that I have any particular right to ask this. I've spent 4 years doing things I'm ashamed of, and I don't have much to show for the years before that except a farm I don't own and a family I've lost touch with. I'm starting from a long way back." He paused. "But I would like to keep starting from here if you'll have me." She looked at him steadily for a long moment, and in her eyes was that deep-water quality he had noticed the very first time he had seen her face, and underneath it, visible now in a way it had not been before, was something warm and certain and alive. "I'll have you," she said quietly, "but slowly, one step at a time." "However you want," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." And that was how it began, or rather, how it became official, what had been growing between them since the morning she had walked out onto her porch and refused to be afraid of him. Winter deep and slow. Christmas came, which they marked with a small real tree brought down from the hills and a modest supper, and a stocking for James stuffed with small things Thomas had ridden to Millhaven to buy, a carved wooden horse, and a set of wooden rings and a small tin rattle, and he had felt entirely sheepish about the whole business, until Susanna's face, when she saw what he had done, made sheepishness impossible to maintain. They sat on either side of the kitchen table with James between them on the rug, the baby absolutely delighted with the rings, holding each one up in turn and examining it with that profound scientific focus. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "He should have a Christmas." She looked at him for a long moment over the baby's head. "You're a good man, Thomas Dunlap," she said. "Working on it," he said. "No," she said firmly. "You are one. Working on it implies you haven't arrived. You have." He held that quietly. It was the most valuable thing anyone had said to him in 10 years, possibly ever. In January, a letter came from Aldous Briggs with news that the federal dispute confirmation had been filed, and the Hargrove Land Company's legal response had been received and assessed, and Briggs's assessment was cautiously but genuinely optimistic. The company's lawyers had mounted a challenge based on the Cherokee sale claim, but the documentary evidence on the treaty sections was strong, and the surveyor's original report had been independently verified by a second federal surveyor engaged by the court. Briggs expected a ruling within 90 days. Old Jeremiah Potts arrived at the valley in the first week of February, driving a wagon with his sister's oldest son and all his tools, and Thomas rode down to meet him and helped him assess what could be salvaged from the burned ruins of his original homestead. It was a cold and sad assessment. The structure was entirely gone, but the well was intact and the fruit trees in the kitchen orchard were alive under their winter dormancy, and the land itself was as it had always been, open and dark with the potential of spring. "I'll rebuild," Potts said, standing in the cold with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground where his house had stood. "I've got the lumber money from selling the furniture before I left. It won't be fancy." "It won't need to be fancy," Thomas said. "Solid is better than fancy." He spent 2 weeks helping Potts and his nephew lay the foundation and raise the frame of the new house, and when Susanna came down twice with food and coffee and brought James along in a sling across her chest, the old man looked at the two of them and then at Thomas with an expression that required no translation. "Good woman," Potts said to Thomas when she was out of earshot. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "Valley needs good people," Potts said. "Valley needs to be a valley again." Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way spring does on the southern plains. The cottonwoods leafed out, and the grass came green, and the creek ran high and clear with snowmelt from the hills to the north, and the air had that particular quality it has in the Oklahoma Territory in April, full of possibility and moisture, and the smell of things starting again. James Fairchild learned to crawl in March and had begun pulling himself upright against the furniture by April, and he regarded the world from his new vantage with an expression of total satisfaction, as though he had personally arranged for the arrival of spring. The full federal court ruling came in late March, 19 months after Caleb Fairchild's death, 2.5 months after the preliminary order. The Hargrove Land Company's claim to the Cimarron Valley was declared fraudulent in a ruling that ran to 40 pages and cited the surveyor's report, the treaty documentation, and the homestead filing records, all of it assembled piece by piece by a man named Caleb Fairchild who had known what was coming and had done the work anyway. Briggs wrote to Susanna the same day the ruling came through, and his letter was 3 pages long and concluded with the line, "Your husband's work made this possible. Your courage made it necessary. The valley is yours." Susanna read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table with Thomas across from her, and when she set it down the 3rd time she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, and then she looked up at the ceiling, and then she looked at Thomas with wet eyes and a smile that was the most completely unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held hers with both of his, and they stayed like that for a long time while the spring light came through the windows and James made busy investigative noises from the floor nearby. "He would have been glad," she said. "Caleb. He would have been so glad. He should have been here to see it," Thomas said. "He is a little," she said. "In all of this, in James, in this house." She looked around the kitchen with a particular expression. "He's not gone, he's just not here in the way I want him, but that's a different thing from gone." Thomas understood what she was saying and agreed with it completely. A man's work done with love and intention outlasted him. It became part of the world he shaped, and it lived there. The recovery action on behalf of the displaced valley families moved forward through the spring and early summer. Several families came back. The Garfields returned from Kansas in May and found their land intact if their house gone, and Thomas helped them rebuild as he had helped Potts. A widow named Clara Hess, who had been burned out early in the Hargrove campaign, returned in June and brought her 2 sons with her, and they broke ground on a new sod house in a week and were farming again within the month. The valley was not what it had been, not yet, but it was coming back, slowly, and with the specific determination of people who had chosen to return to a thing rather than simply staying in it. Thomas had a conversation with Susanna in May that he had been working toward for several months. They were sitting on the porch in the long evening light after supper, James asleep inside, the valley spread before them green and golden in the way it gets in the Oklahoma Territory in late spring when everything is new and the grass is at its best. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of anything practical, though there are practical reasons, because I love you. Because I have loved you since about the third day I was here, and have been trying to be patient about saying so, because I didn't want to push anything that needed to come in its own time." She was quiet for a moment. He had learned that her silences were not hesitations, they were consideration, and he waited. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for a while. I've been waiting to feel certain it was fair to say it. To Caleb, to you," she said. "I didn't want to say it until I was sure I meant it fully and not just out of gratitude or loneliness or the fact that you are a very decent man who has been present for the worst and the best months of my life." She looked at him with those deep-water eyes. "But I am sure I mean it fully." He reached over and took her hand. "Is that a yes?" "That is a very complete yes," she said. They were married in June of 1883 in the Cimarron Valley, on a Saturday morning, with Aldous Briggs riding down from Caldwell to serve as a witness and old Jeremiah Potts, and the Garfield family and Clara Hess and her sons, all present in the yard of the Fairchild homestead. The circuit preacher, a man named Father Wickham who covered 60 miles of territory on a brown mare, performed the ceremony on the porch, where he had performed the wedding of Susanna and Caleb 4 years earlier in a different place, and a different time, but with a similar quality of serious happiness. James Caleb Fairchild sat on old Jeremiah Potts's knee throughout the ceremony and watched everything with bright, attentive eyes. And when the preacher said the words and Thomas put the ring on Susanna's hand, the baby made a sound of distinct approval and reached for the ring. After the ceremony there was food and conversation in the yard, and later in the afternoon when the guests had gone and James was napping, and the valley was quiet in the long golden summer evening, Thomas and Susanna sat on the porch, steps the way they had often sat, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the light change on the cottonwood trees that Caleb had planted, and neither of them needed to say anything about what it all meant because they both already knew. "I want to write to your family in Tennessee," she said eventually. "My family, you said you've lost touch with them, brothers, sisters, 2 brothers, a sister." He had not spoken to any of them in 6 years. "I don't know where they ended up. I can help you find out," she said. "I'm good at writing letters." He looked down at her. "You are good at a great number of things." "I know," she said without false modesty. "So are you now that you're actually applying yourself." He laughed, which was a sound that still surprised him slightly when it came out of him, like a muscle he had not used in a while and was recovering the use of. "That's a backhanded compliment." "It's a true one," she said. "Now stop talking and watch the sunset." He watched the sunset. It was, objectively, one of the finest sunsets he had ever seen, but that was partly the company. The summer of 1883 was good. They worked the homestead together and it thrived, the kitchen garden producing abundantly and the horses healthy and James going from crawling to walking in the course of 2 wobbly, triumphant weeks in July. Thomas proved himself a capable and hard-working farmer, drawing on those early years in Tennessee that he had thought were lost, and found that the knowledge had been in him all along, waiting. He knew how to read the land and how to work with it rather than against it, and under his attention the homestead expanded slowly and carefully, a new section of fencing here, a new chicken coop there, an extension of the kitchen garden that Susanna had been wanting for 2 years. He wrote to his brothers and his sister. It took 3 letters and a month of uncertainty. And then one August morning, a letter came from his brother William in Missouri, written in the careful hand of a man who had learned to write slowly and used words accordingly, saying that he had thought Thomas was dead and was glad to know otherwise, and that their sister Clara was in Indiana with a family of her own, and that their brother Matthew was in Kansas City, and that if Thomas was settled somewhere it might be worth knowing about. Thomas wrote back with the address of the Fairchild homestead, and a month later William wrote again with more, and the thread that had been broken for 6 years began slowly, tentatively to mend. Susanna read all the letters without Thomas having to invite her to, which was the right thing to do because he wanted her to know all of it, and she offered opinions on his responses and caught things he had missed and understood, with the particular intelligence she brought to all human questions, that the repair of a family relationship required care and patience, and the willingness to let people take the time they needed. "William sounds like a good man," she said after one exchange. "He was," Thomas said. "He is, it sounds like. He was always the steady one. You've written to him more carefully than you wrote to anyone else in those early letters," she observed. "You use different words." "Different how?" "More like yourself," she said. "Less defended." He considered that. "I'm less defended than I used to be," he said. "I know," she said. "It suits you." In October, a year to the month from the morning he had ridden up to her gate, Susanna told him she was pregnant. She told him at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, in the direct, factual way she handled all important information, watching his face for his reaction with those precise eyes. His reaction was entirely inadequate to the moment. He stood up from the table and went around it and picked her up from her chair, which was not the sort of thing Thomas Dunlap generally did and which he accomplished with more enthusiasm than elegance, and she laughed, startled, and held on to his shoulders, and James looked up from his breakfast with an expression of great interest. "All right," she said, still laughing. "Put me down." He put her down and held her face in his hands and looked at her. "A baby," he said. "Another baby," she said. "James is still the first." "James is still the first," he agreed, looking over at James, who had returned to his breakfast with the philosophical pragmatism of a child who has decided the adult world is entertaining but ultimately secondary to oatmeal. The pregnancy was healthy and uneventful, which Susanna said was an improvement on the first. She worked the homestead through the winter with her usual thoroughness, accepting help without complaint, and rejecting excessive solicitude with a firmness that Thomas had learned was not stubbornness, but a deeply held conviction that she was capable of determining her own limits. Briggs sent word in December that the last of the Hargrove recovery cases had been settled, with 3 families receiving compensation for their burned properties, and all the remaining valley claims confirmed under federal homestead title. The Hargrove Land Company had dissolved its operations in the Oklahoma Territory. Prescott had apparently gone north to Kansas, where he would presumably find some other valley to scheme about. The law in this case had been made to work by a careful dead man and his stubborn living wife, and a lawyer who knew which documents to file. And its working felt like a small but real victory of the kind that does not happen nearly often enough but matters enormously when it does. The baby was born in June of 1884, on a warm evening with a good breeze coming from the west through the open windows. And this time there was a proper midwife from Millhaven in attendance, as well as Clara Hess, who had become a close friend over the past year. Thomas paced the kitchen with James on his hip, the 18-month-old watching everything with enormous eyes, and when the sound of a new baby's cry came through the bedroom door, James pointed in the direction of it with absolute authority, as if to say, "There, that was the important thing." The baby was a boy. Thomas and Susanna had talked about names for months, ranging across the entire landscape of possibility, and they had settled on one that satisfied them both. They named him William Caleb Dunlap, William for Thomas's brother, Caleb for the man who had planted the cottonwood trees and built the table and assembled the documents that had saved the valley, and the name sat on the baby like it had always belonged there. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed with Susanna leaning against him, James cross-legged beside her with his eyes wide, examining his new brother with the intense focus of a child encountering a phenomenon he cannot quite categorize. The baby was making the small, insistent sounds new babies make, the sounds that seem to be complaints but are actually just announcement. I am here. This is what I am. He looks like you, Susanna said, looking at the baby. Poor thing, Thomas said. I meant it as a compliment. He looked at his wife and his sons and the room around him, at the lamp on the table and the curtains moving in the June breeze and the sound of the valley outside, everything growing and living, and proceeding with the great impersonal abundance of a good piece of earth in good hands. The cottonwood trees were full and heavy-leafed beyond the window, enormous and certain in the summer evening, and the creek was running clear below the house, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do at dusk on the Oklahoma plains, which is to say singing as though it invented the idea of evening and intends to make the most of it. Thomas thought about the morning he had ridden up to this house with a lit torch. He thought about the woman who had walked out onto the porch and looked at him without flinching, with her baby on her hip in her complete and terrible calmness, and how that moment had been the thing that undid him, the small specific pivot on which everything afterward had turned. He thought about all the versions of himself he might have been, all the bad roads that continued past that gate if he had not stopped, and felt the weight of gratitude that has no adequate expression and must simply be lived. Susanna turned her head and looked up at him with those deep-water eyes that had been the first thing about her he would ever have been able to describe and were still the most immediately compelling thing in any room she was in. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That morning," he said, "a year and a half ago." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you glad you stopped?" "Every day," he said simply. She reached up and touched his face, the same direct, unhesitating gesture that characterized everything she did, and leaned her head back against his shoulder, and William Caleb Dunlap made his declaration to the ceiling, and James solemnly patted his brother's head with a hand that was almost certainly too firm, and Thomas put his arm around his wife and held all of it. The valley was alive around them. The families had come back and were rebuilding, the Garfields and the Potts homestead with its new frame house, and the neat orchard Potts was restoring tree by tree, and Clara Hess's sod house and her two sons farming the good dark soil with the energy of young men who believed in what they were doing. The Cimarron Valley was not the place it had been before Hargrove, not exactly, because nothing returns to what it was exactly. But it was itself again, a valley of working homesteads and living families, and the particular quality of a place where people have chosen to stay. Thomas wrote to his brother William in Missouri that summer and told him about the baby, and William wrote back with genuine warmth, and the news that he was considering a move west now that the territory was opening more orderly. And Thomas wrote back and told him there was good land in the Cimarron Valley, and people who knew how to be neighbors. It took another year, but William Dunlap arrived in the fall of 1885 with his wife and two children, and established a homestead 2 miles up the creek from the Fairchild place, which was now generally called the Dunlap homestead by the Valley families, though Susanna kept the Fairchild name on the legal papers because it was Caleb's name and it belonged in the records. The cottonwood trees grew. The children grew. James Caleb Fairchild grew into a serious, curious boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quality of complete attention, and he followed Thomas around the farm from the time he could walk steadily, learning everything Thomas could teach him about land and animals and the work of keeping a place alive. William Caleb Dunlap grew into a more gregarious child, louder and sunnier, with Thomas's build and Susanna's intelligence, and a talent for making people laugh that neither of his parents could fully account for. Old Jeremiah Potts died in the spring of 1886, peacefully in his new house surrounded by the beginning of a good season, and the valley buried him on the rise above the creek where he had asked to be buried, under one of his own fruit trees. Thomas helped carry him, And at the graveside, the families of the valley gathered in the way that communities gather when they have been through difficulty together, and come out the other side, holding the knowledge of each other's worth. Aldous Briggs came down from Caldwell for the burial, which surprised everyone, and took supper at the Dunlap homestead that evening. He was older, the same precise and energetic man, but with more gray in his hair and a quality of deep satisfaction in his manner that Thomas had come to associate with men who have found the work they were meant for and done it well. The case changed things, Briggs told them over supper, with the same directness Susanna had always appreciated in him. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but here, in this valley, the principle was established, and it will be cited in cases that haven't happened yet. Caleb established it, Susanna said. Caleb built the foundation, Briggs agreed. You held the house up while the foundation was repaired, and you, he looked at Thomas, put down a torch. It was as good a summary as Thomas had ever heard. After supper, after the children were in bed and Briggs had gone to sleep in the spare room, Thomas and Susanna sat on the porch in the May evening, the same porch where everything had begun and the valley was laid out before them in the last of the light, the creek glittering in the distance and the cottonwood trees massive and certain on either side of the house. I think about him sometimes, Susanna said. She meant Caleb. She did not need to say the name. I know, Thomas said. Do you mind? Of course not, he said. He's part of this. He's part of you and part of those boys. I'd be a poor kind of man to mind. She leaned against him in the way she did, settling against his side with the ease of something that had been practiced and perfected over 3 years of evenings, and his arm went around her with the same practiced ease. I love you, she said, not as a statement requiring a response, just as information offered to the evening air. I love you, he said. The meadowlark was at it again. Downstream, a frog had started up in the creek vegetation, and then another, and then the whole creek was answering the evening in the way it did in spring, that collective conversation of living things that has been going on in that valley since long before anyone named it or claimed it or fought over who had the right to it. The valley kept its own counsel about all that. It had been there before the homesteaders, and it would be there after, in the way that good land is always there, patient and indifferent, and sustaining everything that chooses to put down roots. Thomas Dunlap had put down roots. He had done it almost accidentally, almost against his own intentions, by stopping at a gate one October morning and putting out a torch he should never have carried. He had been remade, slowly and not without difficulty, by a woman who had decided to treat him as the man he was capable of being rather than the man he had become, and by the work of staying in one place and caring about the things in it, and by the specific, daily, unremarkable miracle of a family that was his. He was not a man who made grand speeches or thought of himself in historical terms. But sometimes, sitting on the porch in the evening with Susanna beside him and the lights of the other homesteads just visible along the creek, he let himself understand that he had been part of something that mattered. Not because he was remarkable, but because at one specific moment he had chosen differently than he might have, and everything after that had been the consequence of that choice, blooming outward like the rings from a stone dropped in still water. The torch was cold in the ground by the gate-post. The house still stood. The valley was alive. In the summer of 1887, Susanna told him she was pregnant again. He did not pick her up this time, though he wanted to. Instead, he sat down across the table from her and took both her hands in his and looked at her with everything he felt plainly readable on his face, and she looked back at him the same way, and between them was 5 years of mornings and suppers and hard work and the specific ongoing happiness of people who know exactly where they belong and have chosen to remain there. Boy or girl this time, do you think? He asked. I think girl, she said. Just a feeling. A girl, he said, trying it out. He thought about a daughter with Susanna's eyes, and her manner of looking at the world with absolute, uncowed attention. It seemed like a very fine thing to bring into the world. We should probably think of names, she said. We have months. You said that last time and we argued about names until the week before. "We didn't argue," he said. "We discussed thoroughly." "Thomas," she said. "We argued," he laughed. "We argued," he agreed. She smiled at him across the table in the kitchen of the house that Caleb built, in the valley the law had saved, in the life that had grown, carefully and stubbornly and with great love, from the single moment when a man put out his torch and a woman did not look away. It was a good life. It was the life he had been riding toward for 10 years without knowing what it was or where it would be, and he was grateful for every hard mile of the getting there, because all of it had led him to this table, and this woman and these children and this valley. Outside, the cottonwood trees moved in the summer breeze, green and enormous and permanent, the way things are when they have been planted with faith in the future, and tended with love, growing larger than the person who planted them could have imagined, outlasting doubt and difficulty, and the small brutal calculations of men who mistake possession for belonging. The baby would come in December with the first real cold, and she would be a girl, as Susanna had predicted, with dark eyes and a temper, and a quality of absolute focus that everyone who knew the family would immediately recognize. They would name her Alina, and she would grow up running barefoot through the valley in summer with her brothers, learning the land the way you learn a language when you live inside it, naturally and without effort, the knowledge settling into her bones like the water from the creek, like the light from the sky over the Cimarron grasslands, like everything that belongs to a person who was born into the right place and knows it. Thomas Dunlap would work that land until he was an old man, and he would work it well. And every autumn when the cottonwood trees went gold, he would look at them and think about a morning in October of 1882 when he had stood at a gate with a torch and chosen, at the last possible moment, to be someone worth knowing. It was the best thing he had ever done, bar none, without close competition, and the proof of it was everywhere he looked.